Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly discussion with S.Friedman on philosophical talks. And today's topic is the philosophy of clinical philosophy, psychology, healing the human mind. And first of all, we would like to mention that S.Friedman is the New York Times clean great philosopher, artist, scientist, and also a great speaker of ours. And we would also like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, Americans with Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you for your questions and your feedback. We would definitely answer them today. And also, we would be looking forward to having new questions from you today. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. As always, Aaliyah, thank you for your ongoing support and participation, your facilitation of these talks, without which they wouldn't be possible. I also want to thank the Consul General Almaty for supporting these, for providing the platform. I want to thank Dana, Elmira, everybody involved in making this possible, making this an ongoing enterprise that brings philosophical perspectives to a broad range of issues. Often, as I've noted before, the issues that I address correspond to international days of recognition. Today's talk was inspired by the World Mental Health Day, honored on October 10th. So, as Aaliyah said, the topic is the philosophy of clinical psychology, healing the human mind. It's a broad topic because it deals with issues of human suffering, human emotional, mental, cognitive suffering. And virtually every aspect of my philosophical work addresses just that issue. But when I thought of this topic for tonight, I would like to give you a sense of the chronology of the ideas, what kind of first occurs to me. Because what first occurs to me in terms of a starting off point has just knowing that it was what first came to mind can help set the stage for the development of the ideas. Well, what first came to mind is a writer, an intellectual that's often been a springboard or a point of reference for these talks because he played an important role in the development, really, of my philosophical concerns. And that's André Malraux, the 20th century French intellectual, author, novelist, art historian, leader of the French resistance, one of the leaders of the French resistance movement during World War II, French Minister of Culture under Charles de Gaulle, and one of the great conversationalists of the 20th century. I've noted before that whenever Malraux visited Picasso's studio, Picasso would stop painting. And Malraux was the only person for whom Picasso would stop painting on such encounters. So Malraux was a compelling voice. And the work of his that's been the most important inspiration for me is a late work of his, an unusual work, Anti-Memoirs. It was written in the 1960s, in the late 1960s. It addresses, by Malraux's own admission, the questions that death raises about the meaning of the world. So it addresses profound issues, but not just issues of death, issues of human suffering, issues of torture to death, extremes of human suffering. It begins with Malraux's recounting of an encounter he had during World War II with a chaplain of the French village of Glières. And in that encounter, Malraux asks the chaplain what confession has taught him about human life? Well, at first, the chaplain hesitates. Confession within the Roman Catholic tradition, within the Roman Catholic faith, is a sacred rite, a sacrament. But the chaplain considers and finally divulges that perhaps its fundamental lesson is that human beings are much more unhappy than anyone thinks. That's something that I always have in the back of my mind. It's something that helps motivate my philosophical work to try to make it more broadly available, broadly accessible, in the hope that it can help address human beings in despair, in states of suffering, which can take all different guises, all different forms. The American 19th century philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "Great nations, great spirits have not been boasters or buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life." It's a similar theme, right? The same idea that we're dealing here with something that is profoundly challenging and that demands strong responses. All the religious traditions, the great religious traditions, recognize something problematic in human experience. The Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition begins with the fall from the Garden of Eden, the fall from grace, where everything was perfect, subsequently not so. Buddhism's first noble truth is life is dukkha. Dukkha meaning awry. Something is fundamentally wrong. Life is sorrowful. Life is suffering. And the Buddhist tradition responds to that, tries to find strong antidotes, strong answers to that challenge, to that pain. Well, clinical psychology, also psychiatry, are in that same tradition of seeking response for human pain, human psychological pain. Nowadays, and for the last 50 or 60 years, there's been a distinction between, when dealing with issues of human mental suffering, mental challenge, a distinction between what psychiatry attempts to do and what psychology, clinical psychology, attempts. Psychiatry is a medical discipline. It's taught in medical schools, and a psychiatrist is licensed to prescribe medications, pharmaceuticals. And for the last 50, 60 years, there's been an emphasis in psychiatry on that approach to intervening, to address psychological pain issues, the pharmaceutical approach. Clinical psychologists are not, in general, licensed to prescribe drugs, medications. They take a cognitive approach. It's a matter of achieving a certain insight, understanding, awareness of ourselves, of our circumstances that may be the progenitors of the pain that we're experiencing. And so an appropriate understanding, a sufficient understanding might be adequate to annul the pain or cope with the pain. But 100 years ago, there was not such a strong distinction between the two, between psychiatry and clinical psychology. And 100 years ago, perhaps the great hope of both fields was really the work of Freud, Sigmund Freud. Certainly the most famous psychiatrist, and he goes down as a psychoanalyst, but probably the single most famous figure in the whole field of addressing the challenge of mental health. I'm going to say a few things about Freud. First, I started reading Freud actually when, around the same time as I began reading philosophy, a little bit later, I was a teenager. I really didn't read much Freud in college or beyond, but I read him considerably. Again, when I was like, 14, 15, 16, in those years, and I was engaged. I was engaged by, well, as much as anything, by his literary style. I still think that Freud survives primarily as a writer, more than as a psychiatric contributor at this stage of the development of the field. But one of the things that's interesting about Freud is that he himself had a sense of his limitations in terms of addressing problems of human suffering. He had actually originally wanted to be a philosopher, but he wasn't particularly gifted at mathematics. And he thought that really disqualified him from doing philosophy or doing it at a sufficiently high level. Now, these days, that, because of where philosophy stands in our culture, not being well understood in many parts of the world, it seems to people that philosophy doesn't have a strong connection to mathematics or the mathematical sciences. But historically, and in my work, not true. Historically, many of the great philosophers have also ranked among the world's greatest mathematicians. Some names that come to mind are Pascal, Descartes, Leibniz. Even in the 20th century, philosophers like Whitehead and Bertrand Russell, who are not really of the first philosophical rank, nevertheless produced a work of extraordinary mathematical ambition and accomplishment in the Principia Mathematica. So, in general, philosophy and mathematical ability, understanding have been intimately connected. And in terms of how I've been representing philosophy in these talks and how I embrace it, how I try to explain it, philosophy is the limit of rigor. And within the sciences, mathematics is considered to embody the highest level of rigorous development, of rigorous standards of elaboration, of scrutiny, of results. So the connection between mathematics and philosophy for me is obvious because philosophy is operating at an even higher level of rigor. Well, the fact that Freud recognized that mathematical ability, mathematical acumen, mathematical standards of evaluation would be important in philosophy, it turns out also in the end undercut a lot of his contributions in psychoanalysis. This became evident in the 1930s. Freud had, by that time, an international reputation. He had transformed the field of mental health. Psychoanalysis had become a passion, within a lot of realms of academia. But then Freud's work met Wittgenstein, the great 20th century philosopher. Now, Wittgenstein himself admitted that when he first read Freud, he was greatly impressed. But then Wittgenstein began applying a critical assessment, to what Freud was doing and to the conclusions he was drawing. And what Wittgenstein found repeatedly, and he gave lectures on this that were transcribed. They've been published as conversations on Freud. Well, what Wittgenstein emphasized is that Freud's work does not rise to a level of scientific precision, that the standards of evaluation in Freud are loose, that are not satisfactory from a standpoint of more serious intellectual scrutiny. When Freud's first major work that gave him really something of an international reputation was his interpretation of dreams. It's actually, I think, even towards the end of his life, the work that he was most proud of. The problem with that work, Wittgenstein and others have pointed out, is that there's no real criterion, no real test for what counts as a correct interpretation of a dream. It's literature. What it ultimately turns out to be, as Wittgenstein pointed out repeatedly and compellingly, was a mythology. That Freud, he said, was not really doing science, but a kind of pre-science. That his work was mythological in that it drew us in for various reasons, but it couldn't stand serious, rigorous scrutiny. Well, in fact, Wittgenstein wrote, it takes a strong and keen and persistent criticism to see through the mythology that is being imposed upon one, a powerful mythology. And Wittgenstein felt one likely to do harm, and more harm ultimately than good. Now, one thing I should clarify here is exactly what it means to be a mythology. Because actually Wittgenstein's understanding of that isn't quite as severe as mine. A mythology is, the way I like to use the term, a representation of the world, of circumstances that does not rise to the level of rigorous standards of evaluation. So if one embraces something because one is drawn to its charm or drawn to some aspects of its appeal, but it doesn't stand up to rigorous testing, well, it's a mythology. Turns out that Freudian psychoanalysis is powerful, has been historically, but mythologies historically have been powerful. A professor of mine at Harvard, the head of the divinity school when I was there, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, one of the figures who was really responsible for my going to Harvard in the first instance, because I found out he was there. I had read some of his works prior to applying, and I was fascinated and found compelling his work on the nature of religious traditions. Well, Wilfred Cantwell Smith pointed out that the Egyptian mythology guided the construction of the pyramids. The pyramids, for 5,000 years, were seen as the pinnacle of human technological achievement. They were the highest structures that humankind, had erected until the Eiffel Tower in the late 19th century. So, and people looked at the pyramids, even people like Isaac Newton, the most important figure in the development of modern science, looked back to the pyramids as representative of a time when human beings had greater capacities and had achieved greater results than anything since. That, again, is a work guided by, made possible by, motivated by Egyptian mythology. Well, it turns out that science itself is a mythology, not because it's not true, but because its results cannot rise to the level of the highest standards of rigor, simply because, and I've addressed this before and I'll address it again, but probably not in detail tonight, so when I get to other issues, that controlled experiments rigorously are theoretically impossible. And they're rigorously impossible. One way to say it is the world is different in different directions. And so when we're comparing an experimental and a control group, of necessity, they're in different environments. And the fact that they're in different environments becomes what's called a confounding variable that makes it impossible to draw a rigorous result. Now, science tends to overlook that. It overlooks it because science is really, as I've again mentioned in the past, a heuristic enterprise. And for heuristics, two things are approximately the same, but within philosophical spaces, rigorously different. Any things that we recognize as two and not one, are, by the nature of the case, of the situation, rigorously distinct. Because all rigor demands is one distinction to make what's true of one object or entity or circumstance, not necessarily, not rigorously true of the other. So science itself is a powerful mythology. Again, not that it's not true, just that it does not rise to the highest standards of rigorous evaluation. So, Freud's work is problematic, okay, from the standpoint of, well, the evaluation of a figure like Wittgenstein. And it's a terrifying thing for a figure like Wittgenstein to find problems, holes, fundamental limitations to your work. But after Wittgenstein's analysis, Freud's work was subject to controlled experimentation. And in those experiments, groups of individuals with neuroses, the kind of, there are two main categories of psychological challenge, mental illness. One is psychosis, the other is neurosis, broadly. Psychoses are breaks with reality. When you hear about people like hearing voices, being schizophrenic, they are manifesting a break with reality. Neuroses are things like obsessive compulsive disorders. People recognize the basic structure of reality, but there are issues that they're facing in dealing with that reality. They may have phobias, irrational fears. They may engage in, as in the case of obsessive compulsive, repetitive behaviors to help them cope with stress or anxiety. Those are neuroses. So most of Freud's work was addressing neuroses of various types. Psychoses, it turns out, are addressed these days with pharmacological approaches, pharmacological interventions. There are drugs that are reasonably effective at dealing with those severe mental disorders. And by the way, if having been, as part of my going to medical school, having done like a psychiatry rotation or been exposed to psychiatry, and having dealt with psychiatric patients, I can tell you that when people talk about like mental issues, there is a profound distinction between the type of mental issues that lead to hospitalization and categorization as being psychotic. Patients that I encountered would speak only in rhymes, would be bouncing a ball always and only. Their engagement with normal human experience, normal circumstance was limited, in some cases, just not present at all. So there are severe orders. And those individuals are typically given various kinds of pharmaceuticals now. So Freud's theories were tested by taking groups of individuals with similar neuroses. They were divided into two groups. One group of individuals would be given Freud's psychoanalytical therapies, his therapeutic approaches. The other group would be given nothing, no intervention at all. And what the research found was that the same percentage of people recovered in both groups. So there was no discernible advantage to Freudian psychoanalysis over simply doing nothing for these individuals. It was those kinds of outcomes against the background of intellectual scrutiny by people like Wittgenstein that ultimately led to, well, the situation when I was in medical school, where Freud's name did not come up once. Not at all. There was no Freudian presence when I was doing psychiatry in medical school at all. So Freud, now there's still, Freud is still studied, he's still, but in terms of being a serious presence within psychiatry, no. And the criticism by figures like Wittgenstein means that he has questionable status elsewhere as well, in clinical psychology as well. Though, of course, there are people that embrace, there's lots of people embracing lots of different types of approaches, in our world. And I wrote something that kind of summarizes Freud's failure to continue as an active presence. And it's something that it has a slight poetic form, and it is in the books of Joshua. Let me just read it to you. It summarizes a little what I was just saying about him. And it goes like this. The best results arise without recourse to force, as Einstein affirmed and Freud never learned. And so the one has a chance to remain, while the other struggles to preserve a single gain, despite such effort, in the face of such pain. The point is that a lot of Freud's results, his conclusions, and I had this sense when I was reading him actually, seem forced. They seem, what a term is, ad hoc. Most important results in the history of thought kind of germinate over time in the mind of a creative individual. Wittgenstein's work took 10, 15 years to germinate in his mind. That's typical for many of the great intellectual achievements. The poet and literary critic Keats has a term for this called negative capability. It refers to the ability of an individual to hold a problem in their mind without rushing to a premature conclusion. Well, my sense in reading Freud was he was constantly rushing to premature conclusions. And that's, for me, the ultimate explanation for why he hasn't stood the test of time. Well, psychiatry, as I mentioned, has gone in a different direction from that of Freudian psychoanalysis. It's gone in a different direction from clinical psychology in its reliance upon, again, pharmaceuticals, drugs, antidepressants, antipsychotics, various kinds of drugs that have a psychologically beneficial effect is the goal in developing them. I did have, when I was in medical school, an encounter that summarizes something of the psychiatric approach and a little bit of the clinical psychological approach too, because when I was in medical school, there wasn't quite as much divergence. There was still interest in by psychiatrists in doing various modes of cognitive therapy, in discussing issues to achieve insight and resolution. Well, when I was a sophomore in medical school, the beginning of my second year, I was experiencing a series of stresses. First of all, I had gotten divorced. I had actually been separated prior to entering medical school. I had been married about a year before I entered, but the marriage didn't last, and I ultimately ended up getting like the final decree of divorce, as I remember, at some point, within medical school, let's say early in the second year. So I was going through a divorce and the psychological stresses of that. I'm introverted. My parents were always the people that I was most comfortable around. But my ex-wife was another of those individuals. She was somebody that I had gone to middle school with and high school. So I had known her, or she'd been present in my life to some degree, just even in classes, for so long that there was a familial degree of association prior to our actually meeting and ending up getting married. So that divorce was profoundly challenging for me. Also, in the second half of my freshman year, my best friend in medical school, and I really had just one such person, my really only friend, close friend, but friend really in medical school, someone who had a similar background in terms of having done research in molecular biology prior to entering medical school. He had actually, I didn't know him well prior to entering medical school, but he had actually been working in a laboratory with a professor that I knew when I was doing molecular biology. And the professor that I was working directly with worked closely with the professor of the lab that this other medical student was part of. So we had very similar backgrounds. He was the person I felt most comfortable around there, and person whose values I shared. Most other people, there was a lot of materialism in medical school. People focused upon the design of their swimming pools when they had money from practicing medicine, but my friend was not materialistic in that way at all, and nor really was I. So again, we had a lot in common. We shared a lot of values. I actually tell the story in Books of Joshua that in the middle of my freshman year, we ended up going to a concert together. He and I, his name was Gordon. Went to a concert in Los Angeles at a concert hall that had lots of stairs to climb. And as we were climbing these stairs to get to our seats, my friend was limping. And he said, well, he had had a bicycle incident. He had fallen off his bike, and that's what he thought the limp was due to. It turned out not to be the case. It turned out that the limp was due to an extremely serious, aggressive form of cancer called rhabdomyosarcoma. Gordon died at the beginning of my sophomore year in medical school. And that was one of the things that changed the course of my life. The breakup of my marriage contributed, and Gordon's death contributed perhaps to my leaving medicine. Now, medicine wasn't what I saw as my calling. I saw philosophy, and related fields. I mean, I was more drawn to molecular biology than to medicine. But, if Gordon had not died, if I hadn't gotten divorced, it's entirely possible that I would have stayed in medicine and my life would have taken perhaps a radically different direction, right? But so there was the stress of my divorce, and there was the stress, the horror of Gordon's death. And there was the stresses of medical school itself. Now, medical school wasn't challenging to me, honestly, academically, but going to medical school is not just an academic enterprise, it's really a socialization process. You're learning to relate to the world in a different way because of the expectations for how doctors are expected to perform. So that was more stressful, more challenging for me. So I had these three stresses: divorce, death, medical school. I started to lose some hair. Like I would go into a bookstore, I remember, and I ran my hand through my hair, and there was hair, and I thought, this is abnormal. So I decided, since in medical school we had access to psychiatrists, I decided, really as much as an experiment as anything else, I was kind of interested in seeing what a psychiatrist would say to me in these stressful circumstances, these mentally, health sort of issues, right, that I was addressing because of these three really monumental stresses as I was experiencing them. So I made an appointment, and I went to see a psychiatrist, a well-known, a well-respected, psychiatrist at the medical school. It was free to us. I wrote about it in the books of Joshua, and I'll read what I wrote, and maybe I'll explain a little bit of it after that. Here's how it goes. It was time for another experiment to test the best of a therapist. So Joshua was the name I used for my character in this work. So Joshua went to see someone famed in psychiatry. The meeting barely lasted past the greeting. The psychiatrist says, death, divorce, medical school. I'd be catatonic or worse, and a fool to offer advice, having learned my lesson twice. But since you ask, I'll proffer this. Take a breath, sit back, take pills, relax. If you like, I'll give you Valium to ease your stress some. Alternatively, I like rum. Everywhere the limits were clear, and in the mortal end, this was something to fear. 2 points about this. First, within the medical model, within psychiatry, and to some degree within clinical psychology, it operates a lot with that same model. Mental illness, challenges to mental health are seen as a disproportionate response of human psychology, an individual's mental state to circumstance. It's understood that if you're experiencing death, just death alone, the death of someone close to you, you're going to be unhappy. You're going to be grieving. You're going to be tearful. You're not going to be functioning well. You're going to be going through a process of renormalization. But it's normal not to be happy at such a time. If you are going through a divorce, the same thing applies. If you're in medical school, the stresses of the environment are recognized. So to be challenged, to be stressed, to be unhappy is considered to be appropriate in those circumstances, not to rise to the level of the demand for medical intervention. That is the medical model. That's the clinical model. That treatment is needed. Mental health is seen as challenged when there is a disproportionate response, when the grieving doesn't stop, or when you're sad or feeling stressed for what the therapist might feel is no good reason circumstantially. There is nothing at the level of divorce or death or medical school. Okay? It's a different standard, right, of address than the religious traditions that want complete solutions. Religious traditions like Buddhism want to end, as Siddhartha, the Buddha, historical Buddha, announced, disease, old age, and death. They're not looking for a way to cope with it. And they're certainly not looking for advice on how to just bear with it until the worst of it is receding. There's a poem by Emily Dickinson. They say that time assuages. Time never did assuage. An actual suffering strengthens, as sinners do with age. Time is a test of trouble, but not a remedy. If such it proved too, there was no malady. But so the religious responses, the philosophic responses are looking for something that is able to establish human happiness in the face of the worst. It's not content to just say, well, this is inherently bad and there's an inevitability to your suffering this. Religions are more ambitious in their response. They want, well, the terms they use, salvation, enlightenment, a complete solution here and now. Now, philosophy, when I began doing philosophy, that wasn't what I saw philosophy as achieving. I was interested in a rigorous representation, right? Something that elaborated incontestable, incontrovertible truths. Past can't guarantee the future. The future decides the past. It was only a few years into the process that I recognized experientially that the level of rigor that I was exercising, that I was demanding of philosophy, could in fact achieve the same kind of results that religions were aspiring to because of the ultimate nature of our circumstance of human suffering. But we'll get to that in a little bit more. The point is that the medical model, the clinical psychological model, is not interested in something as, let's call it, profound, as comprehensive, as the religious solutions. There's an aphorism of mine that sort of summarizes this issue. Philosophy, to answer the horror now and to the beginning and end of time with one question: is our logic stronger than our pain? Our pain in all possible circumstances, for all possible reasons, for all dimensions of mental struggle. My answer is yes, philosophy exercised at the limit of rigor has that comprehensive power. But again, it's a matter of rigor. It's not a matter of belief or opinion or theory or point of view or faith, but of rigor at its extreme elaboration and exercise. Okay, so the other thing about that interaction with the therapist was, again, the willingness to prescribe a drug, right? That's what psychiatrists now tend to lean on. I should say that, the brain is an electrochemical phenomenon. Drugs are chemicals that interact with the electrochemistry of the brain and can alter it, have an impact on it. The hope is a beneficial impact, to help ease the burden of psychological symptoms, of mental suffering. But thoughts are electrochemical phenomena. So there's no reason to think inherently that a thought is less capable than a drug, a chemical, than in having a salubrious, a beneficial, a healthful effect upon the mind and upon one's state of mental health. It does. That's obviously the premise of cognitive, like clinical psychology. Again, the focus on insight and understanding. It is central to the power of the results that philosophy achieves. But again, philosophy is operating at a higher level of rigor than we find in the sciences that are, testing results with controlled experimentation, that philosophically doesn't rise to the level of rigor that philosophical results demand. Okay. There were some encounters that I had with clinical psychologists per se that I want to address a little bit. The first such encounter comes to mind was actually with a cousin of mine who is a clinical psychologist. And one day I was having a conversation with her, and I don't remember exactly how this came up, but I think I had mentioned the definition of insanity. And this was some years ago. This was maybe 25 years ago, before I had really been elaborating a lot of the philosophy that I've been basing these talks on. And that famous definition of insanity as doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, right? Being insanity. And when I mentioned that, her response was, that is the essence of clinical psychology. That is the essence of what clinical psychology advises and understands in terms of being the basis of our mental anguish and the ultimate solution to our mental anguish, not to do the same thing repeatedly. Do something else. She said that was the main therapeutic intervention that she was always advocating in her practice. Okay? So for her, that definition of insanity represented the core, of what clinical psychology was understanding as the cause of mental distress, doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result. Well, I write about that definition in the books, in Phalaris's Bowl, that play I did in New York a few years ago. And I think I'll recite it. It goes like this. Psychology. We hear it all the time. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result is insanity. A cousin of mine says it's the essence of psychotherapy. Tony Robbins, the motivational speaker, trumpets it. It's even assigned to Einstein. And it's wrong. The battering ram proves it wrong. Illustrated in a short story by Václav Havel about a young boy who relentlessly bangs his head against the wall. And everyone thinks him mad until one day the wall comes down. We can't do the same thing repeatedly, even if we try. Not rigorously, only approximately, heuristically, thinking that we can, for all practical purposes, locates us in heuristic space. where tragedy resides. Turns out that there's, you can, if you want to achieve mastery, doing the same thing over and over again is essential. And it will ultimately achieve a different result, namely the mastery of whatever the activity is that you're practicing. Right? So it turns out that the insanity, the problem in understanding our circumstance is thinking that we can do the same thing repeatedly. That's the ultimate trap. And that's what philosophy can liberate us from by pointing out the rigor of our circumstance, and rigor is a difference. So philosophy points out that every time you do something, it's against a different background. And for rigor, any difference can be decisive. How many attempts did Thomas Edison make at achieving the electric light bulb, the filament that would transform modern life, before he finally succeeded? How many efforts did Ian Wilmot, the researcher who first successfully cloned an animal, cloned Dolly? 247, I think, attempts were necessary for him to succeed. So if we're working out, if we're trying to, if we're a bodybuilder, we are doing repetitions. Anytime we encounter something, it's a different encounter. There is something different. And from the standpoint of rigor, again, any difference is decisive and may be the difference that finally takes down the wall. Now, that's not to say you can't do something different, but it's that you can't go off in a different direction after some point. But the point is, either approach is capable of achieving results. We don't know in advance. Another encounter with a clinical psychologist that I want to elaborate, because it was probably the most significant in terms of this talk, in terms of the philosophical solutions that I want to allude to at the end of the talk, was about 20 years ago. A cousin of mine had flown out from New York, a cousin of mine who was actually a physician, older, about 20 years older than me. His mother had just died, and he met with my father and me for dinner. And in the course of that dinner, he talked about his loss. He talked about, the stresses that it produced in his family, in his relationship with his sister, and that occupied the dinner conversation. After dinner, my father went home, and I drove my cousin back to his hotel. Now, on the way, so I'm on the freeway, the conversation shifted from his mother and her death to the death of my mother that had occurred a few years earlier. And I told him about how my father had actually disrespected her memory, that he was making comments like, well, at the funeral home, the funeral director asked him if there's anything he'd like to put into her coffin with her. And my father said, throw a pack of cigarettes in there. It was not a kind remark. And he made other such remarks. And I was finally led to say to my father, you have to stop making those remarks. I'm going to stop talking to you because my mother deserves to be mourned. If you're not going to be mourning her, I am. Well, it turns out that for the next, number of months, I didn't talk to my father. I was honoring this mourning period, and my father was not so much. There was a reason for that. My father, it turns out, had been having a relationship with somebody else, and he ended up 6 months after my mother's death marrying this woman. And it was on Valentine's Day, actually. But I told my cousin, as we were driving, that after the official sort of year of mourning was over, I reestablished contact and relations with my father because he was my last remaining family member. I was an only child. And my father actually was an only child too, so I didn't have any aunts or uncles. My mother was not an only child, but she was from England. All her family was there. So in the United States, I didn't have any other close family. And my father's death was the death of the last close relative of mine. And my cousin, as I'm driving, leans over and says to me, so you never sought out your natural parents? I am driving, and I hear this. And this is the first time I find out that I had been adopted. I was, in the middle of my life, finding out I'd been adopted. This is considered psychologically one of the great stresses. It's one of the great challenges to mental well-being. It certainly was in my case, because I was an only child that was focused on my parents. Suddenly, my world, as I knew it, ceased in an instant. Now, I didn't let my cousin know that. I just responded, no. I wanted to process it on my own. Now, I went home, after I dropped him off, I went home, and what I did was, I went through now, this is, again, over 20 years ago, so I was early in the stage of writing my own philosophical work, okay? And I was still testing it, see how effective it was at rising to the occasion of these stresses. Well, what I did go through was everything that had been a source of consolation to me. Writings, music. Some of the people that had resonated with me, that had been a comfort, were the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, and his teacher, the Greek slave Epictetus. You are an actor in such a play as the author may choose. Confucius, one world at a time. The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, I am a something among some things, and so I go. Mark Twain, life is dream. Dream better dreams. Kafka, somewhere help is waiting, and the beaters are driving me there. Mozart and Beethoven, for whom music was a higher revelation than all philosophy. That's what I did. But what I found was nothing worked. In the face of the trauma of learning I had been adopted, nothing was making me feel better. Nothing that had traditionally worked for me was rising to the demand of that occasion, that stress. So I opened one of my books that I had written, an aphoristic book. Again, this was over 20 years ago, and I, at that time, written maybe 6 or 8 such books of a few thousand aphorisms total. I opened up to a random page. I don't remember the page now. And I read a few aphorisms, like 3 aphorisms on that page. And what I found was that even though the aphorisms were not specifically connected to adoption, they immediately made me feel better. Now, turns out there's a reason for that my philosophical work deals with radical transformation, radical change. There's an aphorism, do not suffer that it ends. It was not redemption. applying to whatever ends, even one's sense of oneself, even one's sense of the nature of one's family identity. No matter what, it was not redemption. So these things made me feel better. Well, I also called a clinical psychologist in my community, and I made an appointment to see her the next day. I told her I had just discovered I had been adopted, and I wanted to talk to her. And it turns out that in the LA Times, there had just been a front page article on the trauma of discovering you've been adopted, beyond childhood. So, that was a topic in the air at that moment. So let's see if we're doing okay with time. Okay, we are. So I make an appointment for the next morning. Meantime, I lived in Marina Del Rey at the time, so I lived very near the beach. So I went out for a walk on the beach. And as I'm walking on the beach, I'm thinking to myself, nothing traditionally that had comforted me was comforting me now. Not, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosophers, not Confucius, not Mozart or Beethoven. Nothing traditionally was working except my own aphorisms, my own philosophical writings. It dawned on me at that point, maybe, and this literally is the thought that went through my mind, maybe it is time to start taking the philosophy really seriously. If it can rise to the occasion, if it can address this stress, if it can annul the pain, the distress, the discomfort of it, if it can make it okay, maybe it's time to take it seriously and begin sharing it with the world. Certainly, if the philosophical thought, if my writings did not rise to the demand of that occasion, I would not be here now. Okay? So the philosophical thought had to address successfully, like a switch, turn off the pain of any kind of mental challenge. That was the demand I made of it, because I didn't want to be disseminating, be spreading a fraud. I didn't want to be spreading something that was less than powerful for all the circumstances under which I was able to test it. And that also previously meant a moment of death during the Northridge earthquake. It meant testing it in the face of various kinds of physical pain. It meant testing it in the face of phobias. And I found that was always successful, working like a switch to turn off the pain, the anxiety, the stress, the distress, to end it like a switch. So I go back to my house and I call up the therapist and I said, I know I just made this appointment, but I'm feeling better. So maybe I don't really need to come in. She said, look, this is a major trauma in someone's life. It's considered one of the great traumas. Come in, we'll talk. Okay. So I did. And we had an hour session. And at the end of that session, and I remember the words and her saying them to me as if it were today. She said, okay, 3 things. First, you're not mentally ill. Okay, good to know. Again, that relates to the issue that I was talking about earlier with psychiatry and with clinical psychology, that it's considered to be a state of mental illness if your reaction to circumstance is not appropriate, not proportionate to those circumstances. It's fine to grieve. It's fine to be upset. It's fine to be unhappy under circumstances that are considered appropriately generating those states of mind. It's not so appropriate, or you might want to seek help if you're still grieving after 10 years. that type of way of evaluating mental health and mental illness. So she said, 1, you're not mentally ill. 2, you suffered a lot of loss, she said. And I had detailed some other, moments. And again, there weren't a lot of people in my life to begin with. And at this point, really, my father was the only remaining. No, yes, my father was the only remaining person in my life at that stage. So she said, you suffered a lot of loss. Then she said, 3, and this is why I'm discussing this now. She said, I can't claim to understand your philosophical work, but whatever it is, it seems stronger than anything I have to offer, anything that clinical psychology has to offer. So if you would, perhaps you could come back one day. I'm not going to charge, obviously, and explain it to me. Well, that also was a transformative moment in that, again, it endorsed this notion of, well, perhaps it's time now to be making the philosophical results more broadly public. Maybe people can benefit from these if I'm having these kinds of responses. If a clinical psychologist says, what I have, what my field offers is not as strong. Well, so what does philosophy offer? What was she looking for? What did I go back and elaborate for her? Okay. There are lots, obviously, all of the philosophy deals with responses to these kinds of issues and these kinds of challenges. But there have been 3 main phases, in terms of how I've been couching, sort of phrasing, addressing these psychological challenges. They're all related, but they represent different approaches. I think I've mentioned before, I've written maybe 20,000 aphorisms in my life. Each aphorism represents a slightly different perspective or approach on the philosophical solution to our circumstance. And the idea is that one aphorism may not be understandable, may not be assimilatable to a given person, but another one might be. And that's been my experience. And all you have to do is understand one of them well, and you basically have access to the nature of the philosophical results in general, because they all relate. But there were 3 phases. The first one that I probably emphasized with the psychologist, I don't quite remember the details of the conversation when I went back and met with her, but at that time I was emphasizing the issue of presumption, that we suffer, that we presume more than we know to the end of time. And it took the form of a pair of aphorisms that I've emphasized in a lot of contexts in these talks. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past, the reality. So no matter what you're experiencing, no matter what you're suffering, a lot of it has to do with your expectation as to what's going to come next, what the implications of those circumstances are. You can never know. And any moment, any day, everything can transform. That's the existential nature of our circumstance. That's the rigor of our circumstance. And it's led to formulations that other clinical psychologists have found compelling, such as, we wallpaper the future with prints from the past. We then marvel at our dissatisfactions, that a lot of our suffering has to do with being enchained by the past. And again, with that first aphorism, the past cannot guarantee the future, cannot control it. Another aphorism that summarizes this orientation to the problem of mental health, of human mental distress, we suffer because we think the past is fixed and controls the future. But the reality is the opposite, that the past is not fixed and the future decides it. I was meeting with a rabbi once, and he asked me of the Holocaust. How does this apply? This was also around that same time. How does it apply to that level of suffering? And I said to him, the future decides if it ever happened and has power to reverse it. The Holocaust. And I thought he was going to throw me out of the room as a Holocaust denier. Instead, he said to me, that is what the Messiah is supposed to say. Well, if the Messiah is supposed to say that, then the Messiah has the right philosophical understanding of the nature of time and the logic of time. So that's what I stressed, the ability of philosophy to free us from expectations that represent a projection of the past onto the future. It frees us from presumptions as to what must come next. Now, that was one phase of the philosophical response to these issues of mental health that, again, in the mind of that clinical psychologist, went beyond what clinical psychology was in general achieving. The second stage of my kind of formulation of this was my distinction between heuristic and epistemic, right? That an epistemic space is a philosophic space. It's a rigorous space. These are all synonyms. I use epistemic because it relates to knowledge, what we can know directly, incontrovertibly. An epistemic space is a truly rigorous space where any two things, any 2 points are distinct. And so what applies to one need not apply to the other. That applies also to moment by moment. That what has applied in a previous moment of our experience does not rigorously apply to the next. We are not, again, enchained by the past. The philosopher Sartre made the comment about World War II, that during the German occupation of France, the French people were the most free they had ever been because they were free of the past. Philosophy achieves that by its rigorous dimension, its rigorous demand. So epistemic space, I've shown you this before. The logic of heuristic space, A equals A. Any two things are approximately equal for some purpose, like two chairs equal for the purpose of being able to sit on them. Epistemic E, A is not equal to A. Any two objects, points, individuals are distinct, rigorously so. Rigor is of difference. It is difference that frees us from what we think must be our fate based upon similar sets of circumstances. Similarity does not govern rigorous representation. It operates within approximate spaces, heuristic spaces, technological, scientific, societal, linguistic spaces. Now, the importance of that category distinction between epistemic and heuristic is whenever you are suffering, whenever you are in despair, whenever you are in distress, whenever you are in anguish over anything, any type of loss, any type of encounter, it simply is diagnostic of the fact that you are within heuristic space. That is governing your thinking. You are being governed by approximate similarities between circumstances. You are suffering your oversimplifications of experience, your oversimplifications of the fundamental reality. That to move from the heuristic to the epistemic is to leave your suffering behind, to move into a rigorous space comparable to the movement that Buddhism talks about from samsara, the world of suffering, of dukkha, to nirvana, that landscape of enlightenment. Well, I've mentioned, if you look around and see familiar things you can name, things you can describe, well, that's the past being projected into the present. And that is heuristic space that you're seeing. Epistemic space would be the space, the world seen with primal eyes, seen for the very first time, where nothing is familiar because nothing has been experienced before. Everything is experienced in its uniqueness. That's the nature of rigorous space, every point distinct from every other. The third stage of this philosophical elaboration of responses to issues of mental health and mental challenge, you still have time, good, is what I've been relying upon more recently as a representation, that we suffer, that we think we can leave the world to view it from the outside. The solution to our suffering is the circumstance that the world is different in different directions. Now again, that formulation relates to the previous things I was just saying. The notion that we can see the world from the outside is really the kind of naive understanding of science, where we're imagining an objective reality, again, that we're experiencing as if we were God, or as if we were a novelist writing in the third person, where we know everything in and out. From the outside, we know what has happened, we know what's going to happen, again, as if from the perspective of God. Now, that is not a perspective that is available to human beings. And it turns out that is not the perspective that gives the most powerful intellectual results. It's not the perspective of philosophy, because it's not the perspective of rigor. That's not a rigorous representation when you're imagining an impossible set of circumstances. It's also not the representation of the most powerful results in the history of science, namely Einstein and Heisenberg, who were doing the physics of existentialism. They were attempting to describe the world as it's experienced from within. And that is the redemptive description set of circumstances. There's a Hindu lullaby that captures it. It goes, and it's a lullaby that Hindu parents will tell their children at bedtime, to help put them to sleep. And it goes, "Child, you are yourself when you sleep and when you dream, and even when you are awake. Look at the world going by." In other words, you are where you need to be from where you are. And that is the point of ultimate solution, ultimate, if you like to use a religious term, ultimate salvation. That is the point of epistemic reality, the world from where we are. And in terms of that issue of the world being different in different directions, well, it's because of that we can't do controlled experimentation. It's because of that we are not imprisoned by the results of science, that they are things that we can use. We can use them to build better bridges. We can use them to build better rockets, to design better cell phones, make better computers, but we are not imprisoned by them as if they represented an incontrovertible reality, because ultimately they're based upon controlled experimentation that is only approximately true because the experimental group, the control group are in different environments because the world is different in different directions. So science does not rise to the level of rigor. It is something we can use, but we do not need to be used by it. And being used by science or that sense is another contributor to states of mental distress. We feel we are imprisoned in some inevitable set of representations. Not so. Okay, I think that, and let me just conclude. There's a couple of lines. Yeah, I have time. I just wanted to say, remember, philosophy is dealing with the limit of rigor. It is the strongest of all possible responses to our circumstance. There are a couple of lines that summarize this. It's from an introduction to one of my books, and it goes, actually, let me just check to make sure I'm remembering this correctly. It goes, only what stands against all possible force can answer our needs. Only the irresistible solves the world. The limit of rigor. That's what philosophy brings to every challenge, every set of circumstances. And it's the strongest possible response to our condition. Okay, there. So that concludes the talk on the philosophy of clinical psychology and approaches to human mental health, human mental anguish, suffering. I have some questions from last time that I'll address. Let me look here. Okay, first question from last time. My talk last time was in commemoration of the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante, the great Italian writer, late Middle Ages writer, author of the Divine Comedy. And the subtitle was The Philosophy of Hope, right? Because Dante has been called the prophet of hope. So, a question that relates to that. What is your opinion of the hope of, quote, sure expectancy of future bliss? Now, that was what Dante wrote as his definition of hope in the Divine Comedy, the sure expectation of future bliss. Dante was a Christian. Now, Dante is also seen as a philosopher, but he was primarily writing as a Christian, which means he's embracing the Christian faith. He's embracing the divine word, right? The Bible as a divine communication. God is seen as something outside the world. God can see the past, can see the future. So Dante here is speaking from the perspective of faith in a God that has communicated, or in a Christ that has communicated the hope, the promise, the certainty of future bliss if one lives one's life, within the faith, or in embracing of that faith, or embracing of the sacraments of that faith, whatever the mode of accommodation to that tradition, that specific tradition is. Well, that's a belief, right? That's something that is, we might call it heuristic, in the sense that it represents something outside our immediate set of circumstances that we are focused upon, right? The heuristic space is a goal-directed space. In fact, heuristics are traditionally defined as things that help achieve goals, modes of analysis, ideas that help us produce outcomes that are in our interest. So Philosophically, we are interested in what can be rigorously known. That is not something that can be rigorously known, so it doesn't fall within the sphere of rigorous philosophical representation. Philosophy is elaborating the nature of epistemic space, rigorous space, and that demands a resolution right here, right now, and independent of all possible future experience. So I'm not a Christian, and philosophy is operating in a different direction from the world's religious traditions because it's conditioned entirely by rigor, not by faith, belief, opinion, point of view. So it's now I've emphasized that rigor can achieve what religions have aspired to through their systems of belief, but it's achieving those results in a fundamentally different way, through a different avenue of approach, an approach of a limiting rigor. Okay, and the second question: what is the connection between hope is supernumerary to rigor and the Buddhist identification of samsara and nirvana? Okay, the idea is that hope is, like we were just talking about, an expectation. We're hoping for something beyond our present circumstance. Philosophy, through its epistemic dimension, through its rigorous dimension, is interested in achieving a resolution to all human problems right here, right now, in the same way that Christian or Islamic mystical union with God, what the Sufis of Islam are looking for, what the Christian mystics of the Middle Ages, like Meister Eckhart, are looking for. What Buddhism is looking for when it says that samsara, the world of suffering that we see around us, is in fact, when it's seen correctly, the world of Buddhist nirvana right here, right now as well. So that Buddhist identification of samsara and nirvana is actually similar to the philosophic distinction between the heuristic and the epistemic. The difference again is that, so philosophy does not live within a realm of hope. It lives within a realm of rigorous attainment, right here, right now, the rigor of our circumstance. But the difference is that Buddhism, and I've talked about this in Phalaris's Bull and elsewhere, comes down to a fundamental logic. The real lasts, nothing lasts, therefore nothing is real, including disease, old age, death, the horror of our circumstances. The problem is that second proposition, nothing lasts, which seems to have been the content of the Buddhist experience under the Bodhi tree that led to enlightenment, well, that's a belief. We can't know nothing lasts. We can't know that everything is evanescent, fleeting. Elementary particles may last, or this moment from this point forward may endure. We can't know the nature of future experience. So it's not rigorous in the way that the philosophic distinction between heuristic and epistemic is, in that the heuristic space is everything not rigorous, where any two things are approximately the same for some purpose. Epistemic space is a difference space, a divergent space that recognizes that any two things are rigorously distinct. Okay, I think that answers that. And I think that those are the two questions I got from last time. I hope that is a satisfactory account of those of the issues underlying those questions. Okay,
Super. So, Stephen, thank you very much for
Thank
being with us
you.
every Friday. We really appreciate that, your efforts, the topics, all the information that you're providing. It's very interesting and engaging. One more time, big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for being with us. We see all the thumbs up, all the likes, all the feedback we're getting. Thank you for that. And we look forward to having you next week. Please feel free to join, ask your questions, and we'll definitely address them next week. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, the audience.
Thank you, audience. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you very much, Aaliyah, as always. And I will see you next
Thank
time.
you. So
Thank you so
have you
much.
all a great week. Thank you.